And finally, as you all saw yesterday, a federal judge denied the Associated Press's emergency motion for a temporary restraining order against myself, our Deputy Chief of Staff Taylor Budowich, and our Chief of Staff Susie Wiles for our decision to remove the Associated Press from the White House press pool for certain and special events.
I'm Keely Gaskins in Washington. A federal judge declined to temporarily restore the Associated Press's access to the Oval Office and Air Force One. The White House has banned the news outlet from certain spaces over a dispute regarding Trump changing the name of the Gulf of Mexico to the Gulf of America.
The latest showdown between NBC's Peter Baker and Trump's press secretary Karoline Leavitt has made a full-blown political brawl over the administration's control of the press pool. Karoline Leavitt, if her name sounds familiar to you, it's because she's appearing in headlines more than just out of business for a while, mostly because of her assertive approach. At just 27, she's the youngest person to ever hold this position, the position of White House press secretary. Pretty wild, right? Before this, she was Trump's national press secretary during his 2024 campaign and a spokesperson for MAGA Inc. She's not new to the game. She started in politics as a presidential writer and assistant press secretary during Trump's first term. In other words, this isn't her first rodeo.
Everybody knew, and we said who she was to all of you because you are hounds in the media who are so obsessed with this for some reason. So in the effort of transparency, we told you who that person is. There are so many bigger things in the world than who the Doge administrator is, but for some reason, everybody in the press corps is so obsessed with this that you were incessantly asking, so we thought, okay, we will be transparent. So now you know who it is.
Karoline Leavitt's approach kind of feels like a mix of past press secretaries like Kayleigh McEnany's no-nonsense fire back at the media energy, combined with Jen Psaki's calm but firm control over the room. McEnany was all about hitting back hard when she thought the press was being unfair, while Psaki had a more polished, strategic way of shutting things down. Leavitt seems to take a bit from both playbooks.
Carolyn, thank you. In the ruling by Judge McFadden yesterday, who dismissed the lawsuit that AP brought against yourself and your team members here, President Trump, in there he said, why not just do away with the entire White House Correspondents Association?
Perfect example of it is right out of the gate in her first briefing, she introduced a new media seat to bring in podcasters and bloggers, making it clear she wants more than just the usual DC press crowd in the room, but at the same time, she's still calling on the big names, CNN, NBC, Fox News, so it's not like she's tossing traditional media aside completely. It's a balancing act, but it definitely signals that she's shaking things up, and that's exactly what happened when New York Times reporter Peter Baker asked her about the White House's decision to control the press pool. Having served as a Moscow correspondent in the early days of Putin's reign, this reminds me of how the Kremlin took over its own press pool and made sure that only compliant journalists were given access, Baker wrote. He drew a parallel between the Trump administration's decision to take control of the press pool and the early tactics of Putin's Kremlin. Specifically, Baker suggested that by excluding certain media outlets, like the Associated Press, from key events, the administration was mirroring how the Kremlin managed its press relations in the early 2000s. Now, you and I both know that comparing any U.S. administration to Putin's regime is a pretty bold move. Baker's question seemed less about seeking information and more about making a pointed statement. It felt like a classic gotcha moment, aiming to catch the administration off guard and draw a controversial parallel. Leavitt did not let that get to her. She stayed calm and collected and wrote back, "Give me a break, Peter." She went on to point out that moments after you tweeted this, the president invited journalists into the Oval and took questions for nearly an hour. Basically, her argument was that the administration wasn't shutting down press access, it was just changing who got a seat at the table. Gone are the days where left-wing stenographers posing as journalists, such as yourself, dictate who gets to ask what. That's a full-on rejection of how the media has operated for decades. She's basically saying that reporters like Baker aren't neutral actors, but part of a system that protects certain narratives while shutting others out. Within hours, the tweet was everywhere. People who support her were cheering her on, saying this is exactly why she's in that role, someone who doesn't play nice when the media tries to spin a narrative. Others, though, were not so impressed. They saw it as an unnecessary attack on a journalist simply doing his job. But if you think about it, this isn't about a single exchange, it's part of a much bigger bigger shift happening in the way this administration handles the press. Unlike previous administrations, they're taking full control of who gets access instead of letting the White House Correspondents Association manage it. The official reason they are giving us is that they want to democratize media access and make sure independent voices get a seat at the table. But critics argue this is just another way to control the narrative and shut out journalists who might ask tough questions.
Press pool will be determined by the White House press team. Legacy outlets who have participated in the press pool for decades will still be allowed to join. Fear not. But we will also be offering the privilege to well-deserving outlets who have never been allowed to share in this awesome responsibility.
Now, when Karoline called Peter a left-wing stenographer, that was not a comeback insult. She deliberately made a statement about the media and its role in shaping public perception. A stenographer is someone who just writes down what they're told without questioning or analyzing it. By calling Baker a left-wing stenographer, Leavitt was essentially accusing him of being a mouthpiece for liberal narratives rather than an objective journalist. In her view, he wasn't asking tough questions to hold power accountable. He was pushing a preset narrative that aligned with left-leaning politics. And why is this important? Because this taps into a much larger debate about media bias. For years, conservatives have argued that mainstream media outlets, places like the New York Times, CNN, and MSNBC, aren't just reporting the news, they're actively shaping it in a way that benefits one side of the political spectrum. They claim that journalists like Baker focus on attacking Republican administrations while giving Democrats a pass. On the flip side, many in the media argue that they're simply doing their jobs, asking tough questions and holding all administrations accountable regardless of party. I mean, that's not a lie.
The power back to the people who read your papers, who watch your television shows, and who listen to your radio stations. Moving forward, the White House press pool will be determined by the White House press team. Legacy outlets who have participated in the press pool for decades will still be allowed to join. Fear not. But we will also be offering the privilege to well-deserving outlets.
And let's not forget where this happened, a White House press briefing. The press room has long been seen as a space where journalists can challenge the administration, where tough questions get asked, and where government officials are held accountable. But when the press secretary turns around and calls a veteran journalist a partisan mouthpiece, that's a whole new level of political combat. After their heated back and forth during a press briefing, Twitter hashtags like Leavitt v. Spaker and Press Briefing Showdown has been trending, with users sharing their takes on the incident. It's fascinating to see how different media outlets are framing this event. If you look at the conservative media, they're calling Leavitt a total powerhouse, someone who isn't afraid to clap back at what they see as biased journalism. They're treating this moment like a win against the so-called mainstream media narrative. But if you switch over to liberal outlets, it's a completely different story. They're more focused on press freedom, saying Baker was just doing his job by asking tough questions. To them, this exchange isn't some viral gotcha moment, it's a red flag for how this administration is handling the press. But what do you think? How do you feel about the way different media outlets are portraying the incident? Let me know in the comments. And what's the tug-of-war between conservative voices and mainstream media? This clash has only intensified over the years. This dynamic is all about how these interactions shape public perception and trust in the media. This brings us to the role of the media itself. Ideally, the press serves to hold politicians accountable, ensuring transparency and truth in governance. But there's an ongoing debate. Is the media fulfilling this duty impartially, or is it pushing specific narratives? Studies have shown that media outlets can exhibit biases, sometimes creating echo chambers that reinforce particular viewpoints. This phenomenon isn't exclusive to one side of the political spectrum. Both conservative and liberal media have been found to participate in this, leading to increased polarization among audiences. So where does this leave us? It's crucial for us as consumers of news to approach information critically. By seeking out diverse sources and being mindful of potential biases, we can form more balanced perspectives. After all, a well-informed public is the cornerstone of a healthy democracy. Now, the term destroys has been used frequently to describe Leavitt's response, but was it truly that intense? While her retort was sharp, some suggest it was more of a deflection than a direct answer to Baker's concerns. Instead of addressing the comparison, she criticized the journalist, which some view as sidestepping the issue. This raises an important question. Did Leavitt effectively address the core of Baker's question, or did she divert attention with a pointed comeback? It's essential for public officials to engage with the substance of inquiries to maintain transparency. By focusing on the journalist rather than the issue raised, there's a concern that the administration might be avoiding genuine scrutiny. But that's what I believe. So the aftermath of that heated exchange has been pretty much crickets. Since that viral moment, the White House hasn't exactly rushed to put out an official statement addressing it directly. Instead, they're sticking to their stance on the new press pool policy, basically saying, yeah, this is how we're doing things now.
As you all know, for decades, a group of DC-based journalists, the White House Correspondents Association, has long dictated which journalists get to ask questions of the President of the United States in these most intimate spaces. Not anymore. I am proud to announce that we are going to give the power back to the people who read your papers.
Leavitt's been pretty clear about why they're making the change. She says the goal is to democratize media access, meaning they want a broader range of voices in the room instead of letting the White House Correspondents Association control who gets to ask questions. In her view, the old system was outdated, and this new approach levels the playing field. But not everyone's buying that. A lot of journalists, especially from outlets like the New York Times, are calling this out as a problem. They're backing Baker, saying this kind of media control could be bad news for press freedom. The Associated Press, AP, is also feeling the heat. They got left out of key events after refusing to use the White House's preferred wording on certain topics. And that's got people asking, is this about expanding press access or just making sure only certain voices get heard? This moment is definitely going to change how reporters handle Leavitt going forward. Some might be more careful, knowing that pushing too hard could lead to a public takedown. Others might double down and get even tougher. Either way, these briefings just got a whole lot more interesting. What are your thoughts? Do you think the White House's new approach will lead to more diverse media representation, or does it risk undermining journalistic independence? How should reporters navigate this changing landscape? Let's discuss in the comments section